Hi everybody. This video is about how to make sure you earn all the possible points on the North Carolina English 2 EOC. So let's start out by talking about length. This is about 500 characters, and I would not stop here. Technically, the rubric doesn't refer directly to length, but a reader, a scorer who sees this much text is going to be very unlikely to give this full points. This is 1,000 characters, and this is more like it. I would try to write this much. If you don't write this little part at the end, this is an excellent response from a student. If you don't write a little conclusion, that's okay, although I think this worked really well, but I would write at least this much. Okay, so let's talk about what the rubric does actually say. Here is the constructed response rubric for the English 2 EOC constructed responses. Let's take a look at what it takes to get a 2. And you'll notice over here that there are only 3 possible scores for each constructed response. And you'll have probably 3, 4, or 5 constructed response questions where you have to write a response using text support. And there are only 3 possible scores. You can get full credit, which is a 2. You can get half credit, which is a 1, or you can get no credit. And no credit, we sure don't want that to happen. But it's not that much harder to get a 2 than it is to get a 1. So you should shoot for the 2, write as much as you possibly can, fill up that 1,000 character space they give you, and you should shoot for meeting all of these characteristics. So let's look at what it says. Responds accurately to the question. So that just means pay attention to what the question says and make sure that you stay focused on that question throughout your answer. Then provides multiple references to the text. I would say at least 2 quotations along with other references to the text as well. But I'll tell you, even though it doesn't say you have to have quotations, answers with quotations are going to get better scores. Then it says makes analytical connections between the student response and the text support. We're going to talk about this in a little more detail in a minute. And it says it's written clearly, coherently, and with attention to the rules of standard English. That doesn't mean your writing has to be perfect. They assume there will be a few errors in it because you're writing in a timed situation without access to references like dictionaries, but you should definitely put a capital letter at the beginning of those sentences. Make sure you have a period at the ends of your sentences. Put quotation marks in correctly. We'll talk more about that in a minute too. All right, so a 1. What's the difference between a 1 and a 2? Let's look at it. A 1 also responds accurately. That's exactly the same. And then a 1 says, as far as text support, provides 1 or more references to the text. So you could end up getting a 1 if you only provide 1 reference to the text, or you could get a 1 even if you have more but they don't feel like you did a good job of supporting your answer. And then it says attempts to make connections, but the connection is unclear. And then here's where that grammar, if there are enough problems, like in your sentence structure, if you don't have properly punctuated sentences, that can drop you to a 1, 2. So to get a 2, to get full points, we want to make sure that we know what the question is and we answer it. We provide multiple references to the text. I would go with at least 2 quotations along with other references. You need to make sure your analysis is clear and sound, and you need to do your best writing. All right, so let's talk about that first characteristic, responding accurately to the question. Let's take a look at this constructed response question. This is one that I made myself as an example, but this is pretty much what it's going to look like. This question says, how does the author use imagery to convey the speaker's thoughts about the contrast between his earlier life and his life now? The first thing you want to do is make sure you understand what the question is asking you. A good thing to do is use some highlighting or underlining. On the online version of the text, you will be able to highlight. So let's do that. How does the author use imagery? I want to make sure that I talk about imagery to convey the speaker's thoughts about the contrast. So I'm going to need to be answering a question about how something is different from something else between his earlier life and his life now. So I am looking in this text for imagery, and that just means details that refer to how something looks, smells, sounds, tastes, or feels. So I'm going to be looking for examples in this text of how something looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels that convey the speaker's thoughts about the contrast between his early life and his life now. Okay, so with that question in mind, I want you to hit pause on this video, and then I want you to read this excerpt. If you're familiar, this is from Kite Runner. If you're familiar with the Kite Runner, you'll probably notice that I've taken some parts out of this excerpt and put in these ellipses in order to just make it a little bit shorter for us to manage in this video. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of text you're working with or how long it is. Whatever they give you, you want to take this question and think it through as you read the text. So go ahead and hit pause and start thinking about how the question can be answered with this text. Hit pause now. All right, so hopefully you just read this text. I'm going to go through a little bit of it with you. Here's what I noticed when I read it. This whole first part is about his earlier life. And the contrast comes up in this last part. This second paragraph is about his life now. All right, so the question was, how does the author use imagery to convey that difference? And now I know I'm looking for imagery here to convey, that conveys how his earlier life is. And I'm looking for imagery in the second part that conveys how his life now is. Now I had to figure that out on my own. I had to figure it out when I read it, that this paragraph is about earlier life and this paragraph is about now. So here's what I see. I see open field of grass, speckled. That's kind of a pleasant image there. It's a visual image, an open field. Not a crowded place, an open field of grass speckled with trees in blossom. I see ankle-deep, untamed grass, but honestly, I can't tell if that's supposed to be pleasant or not, so I'm going to keep going. I see, a kite in the sky. That's a very pleasant image. A breeze, that's a pleasant image. The word breeze makes me think of being on the beach. Shadows dance. Then I keep going, laughter, that's an auditory image, that's pleasant. Music. Music is an image, it's an auditory image, and that's very pleasant. Okay, so I've got lots of stuff to work with here. So in this paragraph about earlier life, lots of pleasant images. Now let's read this second paragraph together. I didn't remember what month that was or what year even. I only knew the memory lived in me, a perfectly encapsulated morsel of a good past. So this encapsulated morsel of a good past is referring back to this stuff. So that's not about his life now. It literally uses the word past. A brush stroke of color on, here's the key, gray, barren canvas that our lives had become. Gray and barren, especially. Gray, barren canvas that our lives have become. Okay, so I've taken the question, I've broken down the question, understood what I need to answer. I need to compare, contrast really how they're different, earlier life and life now. And then it says use examples to support your response. I've marked those examples. So what's next? Well, what's next is to start writing. Now remember, on that rubric, it said responds accurately to the question asked. The first thing I can do to make sure that I do that is use the question, turn it into a statement as my first sentence. So here I go. The author of this excerpt, or I could say passage or text, uses imagery to convey the speaker's thoughts. See how I'm getting this directly from the question about the contrast between his earlier life and his life now. All right, so that first sentence came directly from the question. Now it's time to get into this part. Use examples from the excerpt to support your response. In the first paragraph of the text, the author talks about standing in, see my quotation marks? I'm going to use the exact words from the text, an open field of grass speckled with mulberry trees in blossom. Here's the analysis. Okay, so back to the rubric. I need to provide references to the text, but I also need to make the connection between my response and the support. So basically that just means I'm going to explain the support that I just used. I just used this quotation from the excerpt. I'm going to explain what makes that pleasant. This image is a pleasant one that almost anyone could relate to. An open field, oops, I need quotation marks again, an open field with trees in blossom would be a pleasant place to be. So, the author is conveying that his past was a good or pleasant time. All right, I'm going to pause this and go ahead and continue to write, and then I'll bring you back into it. Okay, so I have finished my response. In this paragraph, I talked about how his earlier life was a pleasant one, and I used lots of details from the text. And then in my second paragraph, I talked about how the author says his life has become gray and barren, and I used the details of gray, barren canvas, and I explained those details as well. And that is my full response. This is about 1,000 characters. Okay, so I want you to hit pause again, read over this whole response, and think about how it's constructed and how you can use this example when you write your own constructed responses. Go ahead and hit pause and read the whole response now. All right, so that's about it for this video. I hope that you've gotten some helpful information from this. Feel free to come back to it anytime. Good job.